All right, well, we're going to continue to truck along in our sermon series through 1 Corinthians chapters 12, 13, and 14. And we got started with chapter 14 last week, and we're going to continue on in our analysis. We only started on the first few handful of verses there in chapter 14. I believe it was verses 1 through 5. And on this episode, we're going to continue on talking about building one another up in love, which again is what Paul is aiming at, and he's using the comparison between the improper use of tongues and the proper use of prophesying. And so Paul is going to continue to talk about that in the passage that we're going to look at today, from the sermon that I'm going to share with you today on this episode. So this is going to cover verses 6 through 19. I think that you'll enjoy it. One thing that I need to lay forth for you, and I do deeply apologize for this, but this whole sermon had an audio problem. In that the microphone that I was using, not a microphone to amplify my voice to the people that were in the room. They could hear me just fine without any amplification, but the microphone I was using to record this episode was out. I don't know if it was a battery issue or whatever the case may be, but so there's no microphone for this episode where you can hear it normally like you normally do. Now this episode was also recorded, video recorded as well. So the audio that comes in came mostly from the cameras, and I just extracted the audio to share with you here. It's obviously not the same sound quality that you hear from other messages, but I'm hoping and I'm praying that you're able to hear it. Still able to hear it, although the sound quality isn't as it was before, and you're just hearing what I'm saying just from the camera microphones and not the microphone that I had clipped to me. So you should be fine, especially if you're wearing earbuds or something like that to listen. At least I hope anyway. But again, I deeply apologize for that. And within the first few minutes of the episode, there's going to be a pause. I don't know what happened there, but I think there's a pause in maybe my imagination, but there's a possibility of a pause in audio a few minutes in that only lasts for a few seconds, like maybe up to 10 seconds at most, and then it goes back to hearing me. So again, this audio had problems with it. I do apologize, but I hope that God is able to use it so that you can, so that you're blessed by it just as much as any of the other messages where the audio isn't a problem. So that's my hope and that's my prayer going forward with this episode. But if you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, or Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures, and also my other account @LTScriptsPod. That's LTSERIPTSPOD. And you can also order a copy of my book, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It. Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com are the two main places that you can pick up a copy of that book. It's a book about Jesus' words to his disciples on the Olivet Discourse, answering the question, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So if you're into eschatology or you have questions about Jesus' words that he mentions on the Olivet Discourse, that book goes through that whole thing verse by verse, pulling mainly from Mark, so Mark 13, but also drawing from the other accounts in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 as well. So I hope you order yourself a copy. Please do if you haven't done so already. I do think that it will be instructive and profitable for you. I hope you order it. I hope you read it. And I hope that you're blessed by it. All right, well, let me go ahead and transition you into the sermon. I hope you enjoy it. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures.
something came to my mind, and I don't know how well of an illustration this is, but I found this this thought coming up in my head. It's a football illustration, but it's post-game sort of illustration. So if you're not into football, don't worry about it. So, do you know how, when there's a game, at the end of a game, end of fourth quarter, clock reads 0, and especially if it's either an important game or like if it was a game that went down to the wire, and then the team that's victorious, the game is over, and then you have the sports correspondent, the field correspondent there, who will interview a player on the winning team, and usually it's somebody who's a big contributor to got that game-winning touchdown or something like that. So they're on the field. The people upstairs say, "Let's go down to so-and-so who's with this player," and so they're interviewing, the person. And there's nothing really ever really exciting about those interviews, at least in my opinion. But I've noticed a trend happening that's relatively new. In all the years that I've watched football, I'd say that this is something that's happening more and more, like within the past few years, and it bugs me, is that when this interview is going on, you'll have some other person on the winning team who will just insert himself into the camera, and he'll start pushing around the guy being interviewed. "Yeah, we did it, baby, we did it. Yeah, yeah." And he just comes in, just swoops in, and starts doing his whole little thing and congratulating the player or whatever during the guy's interview. Now, I don't know how the other player who's interviewed feels. Maybe they don't mind it that much. And really, I tried to put myself in that situation, and I thought if I were in the situation, I might not give it much thought because I'm kind of on a high as far as winning the game and everything like that, so I might not give it much thought. But, if they don't mind it, that's fine. But I can just tell you, just when I watch that, it just sort of bugs me. I just like, can you just let that guy have his moment? Which is 2 minutes at most. And most of the time in these situations, that player, whoever he is, who jumps in and does his whole thing, has had plenty of time before that on-field interview to congratulate the player. Plenty of time. And so you think, why did they do that? They had plenty of time before, and there's going to have a whole bunch of time after this 2-minute interview. It's like, are we dealing with people who just love to insert themselves in to get attention on themselves? So they're stealing away the attention from the person who's being interviewed. And if you're talking about a hero of the game, he's the hero, and now all of a sudden you come barging in. Like, I don't like that. I don't like that. And not because it's not because I'm interested in the interview. I'm familiar with all the cliches. We got to take it one game at a time, and they don't say anything new in those interviews. But even so, I look at that and I'm like, man, that just really bugs me. And I thought, that's kind of a live action parable. And again, it might not be perfect, but a live action parable of kind of what you have going on in places like Corinth. Because even if we're talking about spiritual gifts and we're talking about the manifestation of the Spirit, and if you're dealing with people who are taking this gift that's given to them and they're drawing attention to themselves, number one, it's a whole thing of they might acknowledge that this is a gift that's given to them by the Spirit, and that it's something that's a manifestation of the Spirit that's given through them. But really, at the end of the day, if we just remember the context of all the things that we've talked about, it's really just a matter of putting emphasis on themselves because they'd love to be admired. Remember the whole thing where we looked at the two categories of people? You had those people who were like, man, I'm really not that important because I don't have that gift. And you had those people who did have the gift of tongues and maybe some of those other higher gifts, and they were saying, they might be saying, well, because I'm this and you're that, I don't need you, sort of thing. And so that's what Paul had to combat against in the whole thing of what was going on as far as it related to tongues. But the other thing, and this goes back into a lot of things that we were talking about in chapter 13, and even as we were going into chapter 14, is that there's we have to weigh, what the motivations were of the people who were doing these sorts of things. And so if we're talking about chapter 13, the famed love chapter, I'll have to lay out, this is what love is. And so understanding what love is and how that should be your pursuit in anything that you do, we saw that when we got into chapter 14, he said, pursue love, right? So as it relates to spiritual gifts, the motivation behind everything that should be going on is love. So really, love for people in the community with a desire to honor God and to honor Christ and let him get the honor and the glory. And so he said, pursue love and earnestly desire spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. Okay, and so one thing that I said, and we're going to see this more as we go through this chapter, is that, he's using two examples here. It's not, obviously, just based on our other studies, he's not saying that these are the only two gifts that are available to the Corinthian church, but again, just using two examples, tongues obviously, because that was kind of the issue of the time. He's going to make a comparison between tongues and prophesying. Now, he's not going to denigrate tongues. He's not going to say that tongues is not a good thing. Paul is one who even himself admits that he was one who spoke in tongues. Okay, but the whole thing is that if you're just looking for, just using a foreign language and just speaking it, you're really not using it in its proper way. You need an interpreter, somebody to interpret what's said. Whereas with prophesying, prophesying is something that will actually work in building up the church. And remember, we looked at a few of those areas in chapter 14, sprinkled throughout this chapter, where Paul makes emphasis is that what you need to do is focus on those things that build up, those things that edify the church. And so prophesying does that. Not so much tongues in the sense that, if you're just speaking tongues and nobody understands what you're saying. And so at the end there of what we looked at last time, you can kind of see where Paul kind of brings tongues on par with prophesying if there's an interpreter. Okay, so tongues with interpretation is kind of along the same lines of prophesying, but the problem was that that's not what the Corinthians were doing. And it's very interesting that when we go through this passage, it, at least to me anyway, what it seems like to me is that Paul is stating the obvious here. So it's like, what good are you doing, if you're just speaking these tongues? Nobody understands you. It's just very interesting to me that Paul would even have to lay this out to begin with. But again, when you're dealing with certain people who were blessed to have this gift, but they were misusing it, Paul had to say, look, this is what needs to happen. This is what you need to do as it relates to that gift. And so that's just kind of a short review of what we've gone through and just leading up to this point. And so when we start where we left off in verse 6, Paul is saying, now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? Okay, and I guess I should mention this. One thing that's, I think, important to understand about this is that we're dealing, as Paul goes further into this chapter, you get a sense of the narrower context of what he's talking about here. What he's talking about here is these spiritual gifts that are exercised when the community is together. Okay, so if you want to think of it as a Sunday morning thing, okay, you can do that. But the whole thing is that when they're together, this is how things should go down, and this is what should happen, what should not happen. And so it's having that thought in our minds is important. You get a sense that in the culture of the time, in the early church, the gathering together of the body of Christ, many people had an opportunity to participate. Okay, participate in ministering to one another. It's very different from what we're used to in our church culture here in the United States. And so people had a chance to participate. I mean, you get a sense of that even if you were to avert your gaze to verse 26, where he says, "What then, brothers? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation." So people came, with something to contribute. The question was, in their participation within the community, were they contributing anything of value? And so as it relates to the people with tongues who were using that in an improper manner, Paul would be one that's saying, you're not really contributing anything. So your participation, really isn't up to par as it relates to all of this here. And so he puts himself in this example, says, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will, and here's zero in on this phrase here, how will I benefit you? See where Paul's mind is? Just as he's using that illustration, how will I benefit you if such and such and so on? And so he says, how will I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? I think that you can look at that whole question in a couple of possible ways. On the one hand, Paul might be saying, if I come to you in a tongue and I don't provide an interpretation that encompasses things like knowledge or prophecy and those sorts of things, what benefit am I bringing to you? Or perhaps Paul is saying, if I come to you speaking in tongues, and in parentheses we can put without an interpretation, how am I going to benefit you unless I bring something else? Because if I only bring just my tongues and not an interpretation, then I haven't brought anything. So if I'm speaking in tongues and I just start speaking, I don't know, use your imagination, whatever language, and then I sit down, everybody might give inquisitive looks to one another, at least maybe in our culture. Back then, again, a lot of people were impressed with stuff like that, but really it didn't benefit anybody. So Paul's point might be, is that all that you brought? Did you bring along with that, which isn't of any value, did you at least bring some sort of knowledge or revelation or teaching or prophecy or something like that? Because if you didn't, then you really didn't contribute to anything, and nobody is built up, okay? So he says, how will I benefit you unless I bring these other things as well? And so as he goes further into the text here, he uses these illustrations of what he calls lifeless instruments, okay? So in verse 7 he says, if even lifeless instruments such as the flute or the harp do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? So even with these things like a harp or a flute, played correctly and with the right notes, we might be able to pick up the fact that, hey, there's a tune being played. And, we might even be familiar with the tune and the words that go along with it. We might hum along or we might sing along or that sort of thing, but it communicates melody, right? And so I'm not going to lie, Chris, I thought about you as I was thinking about this, because I was thinking, what would it look like if Chris was up here and just, without any hands on the frets or anything like that, it's just strumming and strumming. It's just kind of like, that's just not an attractive sound. There's no tune, there's no melody. We don't recognize anything of it, so we can't hum along to anything. So it's just kind of just useless noise, right? You kind of think about, remember when we were looking at the beginning of chapter 13 where we were saying, like, if you have all these things but yet you don't have love, I am, for example, a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. You kind of might get the idea or the impression of that. Something that's an irritant to the ears, that sort of thing. But if if Chris is just strumming without any notes or anything like that, and it's an irritant to the ears. And so, whether you're talking about instruments, flute or harp, or he also uses the idea of a bugle. Bugles were used as it says here in the example in times of battle. Sometimes a bugle can give a distinct sound to give the army an indication of what they need to do, whether they need to come together, get ready for battle. Sometimes bugles were used to say, hey, let's get out of here, let's retreat. But whatever the case is, there's a purpose behind whatever distinct blast or sound that bugle makes. It's supposed to communicate something, and to whomever it's communicated to, they understand it and they're able to act accordingly. Okay? So even with those things, there's some sort of purpose of communication. But if with those things, with a flute, if it doesn't give it doesn't give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? So there you have this idea of confusion there. We don't know what's being played here. And then with the bugle, if it gives an indistinct sound, how will anybody be ready for battle? Okay, it's useless when used in that manner. And so Paul draws the connection there to what he's talking about there in verse 9. He says, so with you yourselves, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? And it's an easy question with an easy answer. Nobody will know what you're saying. And as he goes on to say, for you will be speaking into the air. Okay? So again, what contribution, what benefit will there be for anybody who operates in that way? There won't be any benefit to that at all. That's the answer to the question. Now, it's interesting. In verse 10, he goes on to say, it says, there are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none is without meaning. And just by that phrase in verse 10, I mean, you get the understanding. I'm not saying anything earth-shattering here, but language, no matter what language you're talking about, whether it's English, whether it's Spanish, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Greek, whatever, the construction, the makeup of that language is meant to be understood by somebody, at least from one other person, from communicator to somebody who's receiving that message. You don't have any sort of languages that don't have meaning. I mean, just imagine what foreign language class would be like in high school and college if that was the case. That would make Spanish class in high school even more frustrating for me than it already was, right? So, whenever it comes to any sort of language, there's a meaning. And if there's a meaning, that implies that somebody, at least somebody, is supposed to understand what's being said. So, in the Corinthian context, if you're having people speaking a language where in the whole concept of language, something is meant to be understood, then, you're taking language and bringing it outside of its normal intention. And that doesn't do anybody any good. There are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none was without meaning. But I do not know. But if I do not know the meaning of the language, I will be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner to me. Now, a lot of us might know what that's like, right? I certainly know what that's like, not necessarily with people here in this country. I mean, most of the people I bump into speak English, but if you've ever been in another country and you don't know, or you're not fluent in that language, you know what that's like. A particular evening in India comes to mind, trying to make my way from one part of town to the other, not having a full understanding how the public transportation system works. It's kind of a little bit different. So you got to communicate, and you're fumbling around, and you're trying to say, hey, how do I get here? And you have things written down in what you think is their language, and you're pointing and that sort of thing. And God bless those people. They are so patient and so nice and so helpful. But it's not. I mean, you're dealing with a situation where they are a foreigner to me, and I'm a foreigner to them, because there's a language barrier there. We don't understand each other. We work things out the best way that we can, but now take that whole concept and bring it into a time of worship. Again, you have to ask the question, what is being contributed there? And the whole thing is not very much. And so if not much is being contributed there, then that leaves you with one conclusion: nobody's being built up, nobody's being edified. Okay? And so he goes on in verse 12, he says, so with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. So there again, do you see the emphasis there? Strive to build up the church. Now it's interesting, I think Paul is using a little bit of sarcasm here. I can sense it a little bit in verse 12. Because he's saying, so with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit. Because again, what was their idea of the manifestations of the Spirit in its ultimate sense? Tongues. How was tongues being used? In an improper way. So he's saying, look, since you all are eager for these manifestations of the Spirit, why don't you be eager for those manifestations in the Spirit in the way that they were designed, as in the way of edifying and building up the church? Now, I could say a few things here and there about that, but I'm going to reserve that for next time, because Paul is going to give a little bit of an example of what that might look like, just as far as, I mean, not even just with, just tongues specifically, but any spiritual gifts, and specifically with prophecy, and how that relates to other people and building other people up. But here's the one thing that I do want us to understand. Again, when we're talking about spiritual gifts, we're talking about, again, as Paul mentioned in chapter 12, that spiritual gifts are a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Okay? So the manifestation of the Spirit in the exercise of those gifts, you see the Spirit at work, in whatever way that's being revealed, depending on whatever spiritual gift that you're dealing with. But that manifestation, I think, also encompasses and includes the work and the result that you see that comes from the exercise of that gift, as it relates to how it affects the other person to whom ministry is being aimed towards. Does that make sense? So again, we're going to see it. We're going to see how that works in one form next time when we continue on in verses 20 and following. But again, the whole thing is like, if you're eager for manifestations of the Spirit, then those manifestations of the Spirit have to be in the whole realm of excelling to build up the church. Okay? Now, in verses 13 through 19, here's how I'm going to approach this, because in times past, I've mentioned as we go through this passage how I want to be careful not to make everything in this message, in this passage about tongues and whether it's for today or not for today and that sort of thing. There's other things that we can draw from, but in going through the passage, there's certain things that I think are important for us to go through, because a lot of people might have questions about those things and so forth and so on. So this. I'm kind of using both of those approaches here. We're coming upon some things that people have questions on as it relates to tongues and how the use of them and interpretations and that sort of thing. I want to just touch on a few things here, and of course not skip over those things, because Paul addresses those things, and it's important for us to be aware of those things. But as we go through here and as we get closer to the end of our passage, I want to point out something that may not necessarily be the main target of what Paul is saying. I would say it's maybe a secondary sort of thing. It is connected a little bit to what Paul is saying, but I want to zero in on something that I think is pretty important for us to learn and to understand. Okay, so as we get to verse 13, he says, "Therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret." So, as it relates to tongues, if you're in a situation, I've never been in a situation where people are taught, well, no, I take that back. There was once when I was a kid where somebody in church was speaking in a tongue, but she spoke in tongues and then, interpreted what was said. But other than that, my exposure to tongues is rather limited. All I can go by is what Scripture says. And again, if you believe that tongues are for today, I know some people, disagree on that too. Some people say it's ceased, some people say it's for today. But even if you're going to say that, say that they are for today, I mean, it's amazing to me how much of what is seen does not line up biblically with how Paul instructs tongues should be in operation. And I don't think Paul is being unclear here. I think he's being abundantly clear. And so, when you look at, things where people are just, I don't know, they're just, sometimes you question and wonder whether it's actual human languages. I think you know where I stand on that, where when tongues are talked about in the Bible, it's actually meaning human languages. And I will say that in some situations, I do doubt whether something spiritual is happening just based on what I see in the display that's laid out before my eyes. I mean, if I'm watching a video of something or something like that, and then, you have people who are speaking what appears to be gibberish, and even if you are talking about a human language, that's all it is, and you have all sorts of people who are hawking and yapping and doing all sorts of things, but nobody's interpreting anything. Well, I don't think Paul is unclear with how he feels about that. Because again, there is a situation there where people are doing all sorts of things and nobody's being edified. You're just looking silly. And so when it comes to tongues, it's very important, and Paul doesn't make any qualms about it here. It says when it comes to the whole thing of tongues, there needs to be interpretation. Now here's the thing, when we do think of tongues and we do think of interpretation, I think a lot of times usually we think about somebody else who interprets, and a lot of times that would be the case. I mean, and even Paul lays that out. If you speak in a tongue, make sure that there's somebody there who interprets. But what we see here in verse 13 is the fact that, therefore one who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret, which gives us an idea that the speaker of the tongue could very well be somebody who interprets as well. Now, I don't have full range of knowledge of everything as it relates to tongues and interpretation and the specific nitty-gritty of how things work. But I would imagine, but here's one thing that we do know. We do know that tongues are controlled, right? And what I mean by that is that somebody can discern, otherwise Paul would command these things here in this passage. It can be discerned when it is appropriate or not appropriate to stand up and speak in tongues. Okay? And so if there's and one thing in all the years that I've read over this passage and everything else I read through the tongues, I've kind of wondered, how does somebody know if there's somebody there to interpret? If somebody is moved by the Spirit to speak in tongues, how will they know if somebody's there to interpret? Unless they stand up and speak, and if nobody else interprets, I mean, how does that work? I don't know specifically how that works, except to maybe speculate over the whole thing that perhaps what happens is that when somebody has that move to speak in a tongue, that God moves them and reveals to them in a certain way that he has somebody available to interpret as well. Perhaps that's something that happens. But if there isn't that indication within the Spirit that there's an interpreter, maybe this is verse 13 is something that comes into play. Well, if there isn't any other interpreter, you can pray for an interpretation so that you can both speak it and interpret it. Now, is that how it works exactly? I don't know. Maybe. Okay. But the thing is here is that you can have somebody else who interprets, or the person who speaks is somebody who can interpret as well. And so it says, therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret. And he goes on to say in verse 14, for if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. Now this goes back to the whole thing, and I've talked about this before too, I think, as it relates to not only just tongues necessarily, but what some people have cataloged as their own private prayer language, and it's something that's very private, that's very personal, and that they pray to themselves or with themselves to God. I think a lot of those people will acknowledge, I don't know exactly what I'm saying, it's just there, and my spirit is communing with God, and that sort of thing. And again, this is within their own privacy, whether at home or something like that. And I think I've mentioned how I'm a little bit skittish about that, especially if you don't know what you're saying, and especially given the fact that that sort of thing is not unique to anything that other Christians say. You have pagan religions that do the same thing. So I'd be very leery about those sorts of things. But whatever the case, I don't think that this is what Paul is mentioning here, because some people might look at something like this and a passage like this and say, see, this is where, this is how that private prayer language works, and it's just between me and God, and it's just nobody else needs to know, and that sort of thing. But even if somebody's making a case like that, the whole thing is that he says there, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So again, what benefit, I mean, even if you're talking about you yourself, what benefit does that serve? Paul says your mind is unfruitful. That doesn't sound like Paul is painting that as something good, okay? He's mentioning something that's incomplete here. If this is you and you're praying with your spirit, he says, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. Now, fortunately, there's a remedy to that. And I think that goes back into what he's talking about with, pray that he may interpret. So you go into verse 15, he says, what am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will pray with my mind also. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. So the mind is very important. Understanding is very important. Remember, Paul says that there are many languages and none of them are without meaning. So if you're one who's engaged in tongues and it doesn't have any meaning to you, then it's unfruitful for you, and it's unfruitful for anybody else. Now, here's the thing. Somebody can still look at this and they can still say, okay, I acknowledge that if I just pray or sing with my spirit and not with my mind, that's not good. So what I'll do is I'll pray for an interpretation. God will give me the interpretation. So therefore I will understand just between me and God, again, what he's saying, and so therefore I can pray to myself and everything like that. But again, in this context where we're talking about tongues, and if tongues is a spiritual gift, it's meant for the common good, okay? And so we understand that this isn't something that's meant to be kept to yourself, because he goes on to say, because let me back up to verse 15 again, where he says, what am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will pray with my mind also. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. Verse 16, otherwise, if you give thanks with your spirit, how can anyone in the position of an outsider say amen to your thanksgiving when he does not know what you are saying? That implies that, in laying this out, Paul is expecting that something is to be said where everybody else hears you. The problem isn't, this isn't anything that's advocating some sort of private spiritual language that you just keep between yourself and God or anything like that. What Paul is saying is that this is something where your spirit prays and your mind is unfruitful as you're communicating this out loud. And again, he's just bringing to light the problem that he's brought up before. He's saying if you do that and you're just praying with your spirit and not with your mind, everybody else is going to hear you and nobody's going to be able to give an amen to what you said. Again, which is useless, right? So the whole thing of Paul saying, I'm going to pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my mind, which again I think is connected to the speaker, whoever he is, getting an interpretation, bringing that out to offer to the entire congregation, and with not only the speaker understanding, but now all the congregation understanding, they can now say and give the amen to what was said. Otherwise, nobody benefits, okay? And again, you might, I brought this up last time, I think. If not, if I did, I'll bring it up again. But I mean, the question that might come in some people's minds is that, okay, but why are tongues why tongues in the first place? If you have a tongue and then there's an interpretation so that people can understand, why can't you just bypass the tongues and just everybody speak in a language that you understand? And that's a good question. And what I would say is that tongues, I think, would be I think you could see that as a way of God just displaying his power in a miraculous way, so that people can have a full understanding of God's presence in their midst, and as he speaks truth to the congregation. Now, is that saying that tongues are necessary in order for people to know that God is in their midst? No, that's not what that's saying. God can move and act in any way that he chooses whenever he chooses to do that. But I would say that, and I think I did mention this because I seem to remember using the example of Acts chapter 4 when the apostles and the other Christians came together to pray, after they had been persecuted by the council. And they prayed, and remember what the text said in Acts chapter 4, the place where they were speaking was shaken. I think that that was God's way of saying, I hear you, and I'm with you every step of the way. Now, was that a necessary thing in order for the apostles and everybody else to know that God was with them? No, I think they understood, but I think that by God's grace, He allowed that to happen to give them further assurance that He was with them. And in the same way, I think tongues might operate in the same way. But again, it's one thing to have a display of the power of the Spirit, but again, the real intention behind that is not only that, but also so that people can get some sort of instruction or encouragement or whatever, so that people are edified at the same time. And so that's what needs to happen. So in verse 17 he says, "For you may be giving thanks well enough, but the other person is not being built up." So again, there's that emphasis again. And he's saying you might be giving thanks. That might be something that's actually, happening, but nobody else is being built up. Nobody else is being edified in that. Okay. Now, I mentioned that there's something that I want to zero our attention on, just as it relates to, it's very much closely connected to the whole thing of what Paul is aiming at, just as far as people being built up, people being edified, and people being edified within the context of community. Now, you can use that whole thing of community in several different contexts, whether we're talking about this, what we do here, or whether you're with one or two or three other people in another venue or something like that. I think that this applies as well. But I want you to notice something here. Let's just, everything that we've talked about as far as tongues, interpretations, and everything like that, important things, let's kind of set that aside a little bit here. Because this is something that I noticed when I looked at this text. Well, actually, no. Let me bring tongues back for a quick second. And just point out an interesting observation in that with the whole thing of tongues, in verse 13 and following, notice that specifically what Paul is talking about when he's saying that, using tongues in this way, he's talking about somebody singing or somebody praying. I think that's an important observation to make, because one of the things that I've said is that, I've listened to both sides of the tongues debate and whether it's for today, and a lot of people who will say that it's ceased, will be quick to say, will be quick to emphasize that tongues are a sign gift, and it was meant for revelation. When there's new revelation, tongues are being spoken. And I think for a lot of those people, it's not only a matter of them saying that tongues are used to confirm new revelation, which I think that it did in certain parts of the book of Acts, but in just listening to some debates, and I'm not trying to paint everybody with a broad brush, because I know that even within certain schools of thought, there's certain variations on how people think about these things. But one thing that I've noticed a few people saying is that when somebody speaks in tongues, it's equivalent to "Thus saith the Lord," as if they are actually giving new revelation. And I don't think that that's the case. I mean, especially with a passage here. This isn't a "Thus saith the Lord" sort of thing that Paul is using as an example of how tongues should be used. And I'm a firm believer, and this is where I do agree with people on the cessationist side. If you have somebody who's using those things as a "Thus saith the Lord" thing, you reject them outright, because there is no new revelation. We have everything we need in Revelation here. But it's not just for that. We have singing, we have praying in tongues as well. Okay? And I don't see that as a "Thus saith the Lord" sort of thing, as if they're giving new revelation. Okay? So I just thought that's important to point out there. Now, set that aside. And we just think about this here for a second, because if we're talking about, in this whole passage, this whole idea of building up and edifying one another, do you notice here that in this passage, Paul is saying that when it comes to giving thanks and even with prayer, that those things can serve within the community of being tools of edifying other believers. And I don't know, or I don't think that we usually think along those lines, which to me really enhances the whole thing of the great value that there can be with praying with other believers, okay? And so, and now I'll say this, I don't think that when we're talking about prayer or worshiping in a group, that the edification of other believers is its sole and primary purpose. I wouldn't say that, but God can use those in times of community when we're together, so that we are built up, so that we are edified. Okay? And I think maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you'll disagree with me. But I think that for our culture today, this is something that might be a little bit hard or difficult to grasp because of the way that we use prayer normally. Okay? A lot of times, the sole and primary way that we use prayer is anything that's situational, which isn't bad. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that that's bad. There are a lot of people that I know on Twitter, a lot of people I know who will post a tweet on Twitter saying, hey, this and this and this is going on, can you please pray? And I'll retweet their tweet to call attention to that, say, hey, please pray for our brother and our sister there who's going through this, or this sort of thing is happening, they're going to the hospital, or whatever. So don't misunderstand me in saying that I think that that is inappropriate or bad or wrong, okay? But it's not the complete story, okay? And even when it comes to praying for people, again, one of the things I ask in my mind is how much of it is situational, how much of it is the whole thing when we pray for one another for our spiritual well-being. You know what I'm talking about when I'm saying that? Do you see the distinction that I'm making there? And obviously, if we're talking about in a passage like this, when it's talking about edifying and building up and that sort of thing, at the very least, I think if we're talking about praying for somebody, I think there's something to be said about praying for collectively our spiritual well-being, and whatever that might be, and maybe within those times we might be open to share it spiritually. This is where I am. I need help and I need your prayers, and we can gather around and pray for one another in that way. But I wouldn't even say that prayer as it relates to the community context is limited just to that as well. I think it can go beyond that, where we not only pray for one another, but we pray with one another. You know what I mean when I'm saying that? It's not necessarily only where we would be together and we're praying for one another, although that is important. I think that's something that is good to do. But I mean, you think about what is praying with somebody outside of the whole thing of praying for somebody, what would that look like? I think that you can just go to someplace like the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? I mean, even focus your whole thought on the whole thing of, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, praying for the will of God. The question is, do we know what God's will is? And if you don't, where do you go to find out what God's will is? Right here. And that's going to require us to broaden our understanding, a lot of people's understanding of what God's will is, because again, a lot of times when we think of God's will, we think of what is God's will for my life. What city should I live in? What job should I take? That sort of thing. And those things God can have a specific will for you, but trust me, God's will expands well beyond that. We're talking about, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This explains what God's will is right here. And so when it comes to praying with one another, we pray that together as a unified group, coming together and just expressing those things to God. And how I suspect that the whole building up and edifying works into that whole thing is because if you're praying for God's will, you're praying according to what this says. If you're praying according to what this says, you get a great deal of encouragement because you're being reminded, your spirit is being reminded of what God has revealed. as far as where he's going, where human history is headed, his plan of salvation, you know, all sorts of things can work into that whole thing, okay? You know, one of the things that I was thinking of related to this was a time it was me and 6 other people, and this is when I was somewhere else overseas, and we were gonna have an evening of prayer. Let me just tell you right off the bat, that evening of prayer we had was amazing. It was amazing. Now, our sole and primary purpose going into that was not, let's have a time to edify one another. That's not how we approached it. It was an evening of prayer. But what came out of that was not only our prayers and our praise to God, but I think, I can only speak for myself, but I think for everybody else involved as well, we came out there incredibly edified and strengthened. We came together as a group, and it was completely Spirit-led. By that I'm meaning that we didn't really have an agenda, so to speak, of this is how we're gonna pray. We're gonna pray for this and this and this and this. And that's not saying that if we did do that, then that would have been the wrong way to do that. That's not what I'm saying either. It's just, this is just how we approached it. We had a guy there who led our worship whenever we did get together on Sunday mornings, and you know, if he felt led, he'd bust up the guitar, sing a couple of worship songs. Sometimes it was just silence for a few minutes before we just kind of just prayed, and just our hearts just overflowed to God, beseeching him, praising him. You know, great thing about praise is that, I mean, when you're praising God, a lot of times you're praising him for one of 2 things: who he is and what he's done. You know, when you praise him and you thank him for those things, how is that not edifying? Even if it's not anything that's connected to me myself, if I'm hearing somebody praising God over, you know, because of what they're doing in their lives, that's very encouraging to me. I love hearing about how God is working in other people's lives. I love hearing people praise God about just for who he is. Reminds me of the kind of God that we serve. And so there we were as a group of 7 people, just there, and for 2 hours, just having a tremendous just time together, and just our spirits knit together, praising God, thanking God, praying to God, beseeching God, you know, just for all sorts of things. I mean, a lot of it was missional focus, and that was a big part of it too, but it even went beyond that as well. And so, again, that wasn't, I mean, the purpose of that when we set that up wasn't, hey, let's set up a time where we're, you know, a time of edification. That's not what we called it. It was an evening of prayer, okay? And like I said, it was for like a couple of hours, but it doesn't have to be for a couple hours. Do it for 30 minutes, 20 minutes, it's just as good. But I mean, the whole idea is that there was just something about being together as a group, and as one person was praying, our spirits agreeing with them as they're praying, at the same time exalting God because of who he is and what he's done. You know, having common prayer requests just as it related to the people that we're ministering to. You know, that was edifying. That was, we were all built up during that time, I would say. And so I just say that because, again, you know, as it's, I would say, let's say indirectly implied here, you know, because I don't think Paul's primary lesson here is that, hey, you can be edified when you pray and you give thanks in a community. I mean, he's using all of this as examples to talk about the whole thing of tongues and interpretations and things like that. But even beneath the surface, reading between the lines, you see what that's saying there? And so, one thing that I would hope is that something like this would be revived within our churches. If it isn't going on as much as we would like it to. I think there's something to be said about that communal praying there. And I understand, I realize that there are barriers to that for a lot of people, because a lot of people don't like to pray out loud. I understand that. I think that, you know, people will look at other people and say, man, I won't pray like that person does. Really, that's not the important issue of the matter. I will say this, though. Well, I'll say at the one time, on one hand, it's not about how somebody sounds, but you know what I think people are encountering a lot of the times when they hear somebody else pray, and maybe they're intimidated. I hope that they're not, because I don't think that that's what they're trying to do. But 9 times out of 10, you know who I think that person is hearing when they're praying? They're hearing somebody who's familiar with this, praying according to God's will. So there's a connection of even being familiar with what's in here. Again, it goes back to the question, how familiar are we with the will of God? But regardless, though, even no matter where you are, though, and even if you don't say anything, you just come together and your spirit just agrees with other people who pray, there's something to be said about that. And it really gets me excited, really just with the thought of it. But I hope that if there's nothing else that you take away, just kind of thinking about that for a few days and just kind of letting your mind ruminate over that sort of thing is pretty exciting. Verses 18 and 19, we'll just close this out here, where he says, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. Nevertheless, in church, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Now again, Paul is not saying tongues are bad. And again, I take that back. He's not saying tongues in general are bad, but again, when he's saying 10,000 words in a tongue, I think what's implied there, 10,000 words in a tongue without interpretation. Because again, it's a matter of value. He's saying that you have 5 words with my mind that will be of value to people, as opposed to 10,000 words in a tongue. So in a situation like this that Paul lays out here, more isn't always better, right? 5 words will spoken with the mind, and I think implied there he's talking about prophesying. Is he said he would rather do that than to speak 10,000 words with it in a tongue. So it's not about being impressive. It's not about from a spiritual perspective, being the guy who jumps in front of the camera during the interview. It's not about that, right? The question is, in that whole realm of participation, what's being contributed? Is that contribution of value, i.e., is it with the intention of ministering to somebody, or is it just to bring attention to yourself? And again, it just comes back full circle, is asking the question, what's our motive in all of this? Is it love? I think if you pursue love, as it says there at the beginning of this chapter here, and you're just walking in the Spirit as we've been called to do, I think we're in a better position to honor God and to minister to other people biblically the way that we're intended to. And so that's what Paul is after as he's talking about that. So we'll leave it there, but when we pick up next month in verses 20 through 25, I think we're going to see some amazing things here. And again, I talked about before about the manifestation of the Spirit and striving to excel in building up the church. Just kind of what the whole thing of manifestation of the Spirit, what that might look like as it relates to how it affects other people. And I think that's an exciting thing that we're going to see as well. But for now, let's go ahead and pray. It's not as hot up here, so maybe there isn't a conspiracy. It is a little bit warm, but it's not as warm, so we'll see. Anyway, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for your word. Thank you for your Spirit who guides and leads us, Lord, and who convicts. And Lord, we ask for that conviction in our hearts whenever we feel the fleshly pull of making community, making ministry, making anything else of you about us. Lord, may your Spirit lead us and guide us in operating in love for our brothers and our sisters in Christ, that we would have a God-given concern for their spiritual well-being, for their upbuilding of their growth, their maturity. And may we have a desire to see you uplifted and exalted, Lord. And I pray that you would correct us when we stray from that path and we want to make it more about ourselves. Lord, I just pray that as we've looked at your word and as we continue to look into your word as it relates to all of this, that you would strengthen our understanding of this, and just that you would continue to teach us even outside of this time. As we think about these things, as we meditate on your word, and as we let it settle in our hearts, Lord, I pray that you would continue to speak to us, Lord. And as you engage with us in that time, as we meditate on your word, may it work more towards our transformation and our growth. And that we can put these things into practice so that you can be honored and glorified in and through us. So we thank you for this morning, this opportunity that we've had this morning to come and worship you, to listen to your word. And just pray that even as we leave this place, Father, that we would continue to walk in your spirit, that you would be exalted in our lives, in our speech, and in everything that we do, and that you would be glorified. So we pray these things in Jesus' name.